morning, everyone. Once again, we'll try to keep it relatively on the shorter end compared to some of the longer times. So we're going to start today. We're going to jump right in with a shaila that was asked of Harav Yosef Mashash Mesas, whichever way you want to pronounce it, in the Shailas Tshuvas Mayim Chaim. Before I jump into the question, though, I will provide some background as to who he was and when he lived. Yosef Mesas, or Mashash, was born in Meknes in Morocco in 1892. At a pretty young age, he became a Rav in Algeria, in the city of Tlemcen, which is, if you know Jewish cities in Algeria, that's probably one of the top two or three. Years later, he returned to Meknes in Morocco, where he became a Dayan, and he was very involved in the Yoni Kehila. He had a connection with the king of Morocco. In 1964, he moved to Eretz Yisrael. Soon became appointed the Rav of Haifa, and he passed away in Eretz Yisrael in the year 1974. And Shalas Tshuvas Mayim Chaim is one of his Svarim. It's halachic sefer Shalas Tshuvas. What connection, if any, did he have to Chabad? So it seems that he was in Meknes when Chabad was active there, and according to the testimony of at least one Talmud in the yeshiva there, he heard shiurim in the yeshiva from Rav Yosef Mashash. He's also, you may have heard of Shalom Mashash, who had more of a connection with the Rebbe. Shalom was his cousin's son, so they are related. So the first chelik of Mayim Chaim was printed in Morocco in 1934 in Fez, and the second chelik was printed in Yerushalayim in 1967. So in Shalas Tshuvas Mayim Chaim, Eira Chaim, Aleph Simon Pei Vav. As we'll see from the date at the end, this seems to be from either the late 20s or the early 30s. So he starts off, he says, Poye Ira Tlemcen. There's a Beis HaKnesses Yedua, there's a well-known shul, and it's named after Adinenu Harav, as Rosh Tevis. Reb Aleph doesn't say the full name, but Reb Aleph Alen Kawa, or Alen Kaveh. So he doesn't say the name, but apparently what he means, he's referring to Reb Ephraim Alen Kaveh, or Ankaveh. He lived much earlier. He lived in the 1400s. He was originally from Spain, and he was born in Toledo, and then he lived around the time of the Gzeiras Kufnan Aleph. For those familiar, even before you had the Gedish of Reish Nun Beis, about 100 years earlier, 1391, there were some very wild attacks on the Jewish people in Spain, and many of them fled to North Africa, to Morocco, to Algeria. So that's how he ended up. He learned by the Ran back in Spain, but then he ended up in North Africa, and he ended up finally in Tlemcen in Algeria. And his name, Ephraim Ankaveh, is one of the most legendary names apparently among North African Jewry, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. And this shul that Rav Mashash is referencing is, at least according to the encyclopedias, is it's still there till today. A famous shul that was named after him. So Rav Mashash references this shul, and he says it's built with pillars. You can find pictures of it. But it was an old building, and as time went on, plaster was cracking. It wasn't in great shape, and it didn't look very nice anymore, and they needed to raise a lot of money in order to maintain the shul, repair the shul. And the community at that time did not have funds. So he says we have one generous individual. His name is Rav Eliyahu Sayag, and he's stepping up to the plate. He is willing to help pay, cover the expenses of retiling the shul with marble, with designs, so that it lasts for a long time. So what's the problem? Everything sounds great. The problem is that this person is a real estate owner here in Tlemcen, and he has a lot of karkois that he gets his parnasa from. Among his karkois, he has a big chotzer in the Reva Hagoyim, the Gentile quarter at the edge of the city. And this chotzer, he says, is Yedua L'Mishkan Hazima V'chol Te'eva. It's the red light district of the town. He owns it. And how does it work? So he doesn't actually manage that property. He has a guy who rents it, and that guy takes a cut out of every esnan. He takes a portion, and then this guy pays a sach cuts of nida yem b'yemai. There's a set amount that he has to pay every day to the Yiddish owner, and he gets to keep the rest. So due to this information, there were ma'ararim that said that we can't accept this Yid's donation to the shul because we know in the Torah it says Asnan Zoino Mechir Kalev, and they wanted to taina that this is included in that category, the guy who owns the property, that etc. etc. And I was asked, Rav Mashash says, I was asked by one of the Chashuvim, mentions his name as well, are we allowed to accept a donation or not? And he asked that I write it, I put it in writing, a clear tshuva to set the record straight. So this is the tshuva, right? So this is the specific shaila, a specific case. He even mentions the name of the guy, no shame there. So we're going to continue going through the shaila, but I'm essentially bringing this as a way of launching into this general topic. Is it acceptable, is it okay to accept money from illicit, shady sources, issues, things like that? Of course, surely none of us are at all familiar with any such situation. This is all theoretical, but it's possible, theoretically, for the shaila to come up, perhaps on shluchas, etc. So let's continue going through the tshuva now that we saw the shaila. So he says, Tairas hakanos kochazina hacha. I think this is, overdoing it. Kanos, extreme. I've already been asked and I've already answered that if you look in the Torah, you want to know what the Torah is talking about. What's the Isser min ha-Torah? The Torah is talking about something that you can be makriv itself on the mizbech. So, for example, if you gave a behema tahira or birds or shemen, silas, that's what the Torah is talking about. But if you gave money and she spent the money and bought a carbon, you're allowed to bring the carbon. And even if the object itself was given, but that still only applies to the object itself, the eston itself. But let's say she received wheat and she ground it into flour or oil and she pressed it into olives, she pressed it into oil. Also mutter. It says in the Braisa there, and in Tamura, which is where this sugya is, and the Rambam paskin that way. And his B'chalal Mashma from Stam Shas and Paiskim that the estan itself is only asur for tzarchei hamikdash, specifically in the context of a karban meis hamikdash. But to do a mitzvah, if you gave shemen and she wants to be malik in the Beis HaKnesses, who said that's a problem, even if you used oil itself? So the ganze Shaila fangt sich nicht an. So what's the problem? Why are we even having this discussion? So he says, the way he frames it, V'loi nimtza oiser b'zeh, rak Rabbeinu Yeruchim, hevi dvarav moiram is the Ramah, b'darkei Moshe, u'b'shulchan aruch Erechaim, simen kuflin gimel. So no one else did accept the Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah, b'shem Rabbeinu Yeruchim. So let's pause for a second and look those B'kairas up ourselves. So first of all, Rabbeinu Yeruchim is an interesting, interesting member of the Rishonim who was mechaber, an interesting work. So Rabbeinu Yeruchim ben Meshulam, we know him as usually Rabbeinu Yeruchim. Sometimes you see in Sfarim, Reish Yud Vav is the Rosh Tevis that we settled on and agreed on will stand for Rabbeinu Yeruchim for some reason. So he lived in the 1300s, the first half of the 1300s. He was mechaber Sefer Misharim, and he was mechaber Sefer Terldus Adam V'Chava. So, according to his biography, is a little unclear, but at least the official consensus seems to be that he was born in province, and then after the Jews were expelled from France in 1306, he ended up in Spain. He learned a little bit from the Rosh, from others, and then in the year Tzaddik, which I presume is the year 1330, he began writing Sefer Misharim, and he finished it within a few years, and then towards the end of his life, he wrote the other Sefer Toldos Adam V'Chava. So Sefer Misharim goes through Dinim Mamonos, and Sefer Toldos Adam V'Chava goes through Isser V'Heter, practical Isser V'Heter, and it's divided in a very interesting kind of way. Toldos Adam is divided into chapters that cover a man's life from when he's born until he gets married. It includes brachas and tefillas and that part of Erechaim, Chaim, what we know as Erechaim Chaim today. And the second part, Chava, is all the din that apply once a person gets married. And it's divided into nesivim. Each nesiv is its own general theme. So till from Aleph to Chav Aleph is Adam, and from Chav Beis to Chav Ches is Chava. Even though the Svarim are relatively widespread, no one really refers to them by the name. They're just known as Rabbein Yeruchim. That's the name that everyone knows. My impression is it's actually a pretty sort of a unique and standalone chibur. Usually when you have Yishayin or Chiburim, usually there's other Svarim that come from the same genre, so to say. There's a lot of overlap, a lot of similar material. Rabbeinu Yeruchim seems to sort of be in his own unique category with his own unique ideas. Also, his division, his attempt to divide the halachas is a interesting attempt to divide the halachas that way. So anyway, in Chelek Chava, in the Siv number 22, so the first one is about Kiddushin, Dinyei Mekadesh, Miskadeshes, etc. What's Nesiv 23? Nesiv 23 is Dinei Noshim, V'yichodon, Dinei Yichod, Yichad Behema, all of those types of inyanim, Noshim Ha'asuras L'Yisrael, L'Koyein, Asurim Lavim V'Kol, Eved, Shivcha Ger, that whole category he puts together in the Siv Chav Gimel. So and each Nesiv in turn is divided into Chalakim. So the end of Chelek Aleph of Nesiv Chav Gimel, we have Chava, we have the following portion. In the middle of talking about these types of things, all of a sudden, Barf Sarayim, Esnan Zaina, Asra Torah to bring as a carbon. And then he adds, V'hu adim b'zman hazeh, lasas mimenu shum davar lebeis hakneses. So, right away, he says the same thing applies now to use for a shul, like a Sefer Torah, or Bedek Habayis, or Ner, or Shemen. Right? We'll see in Shulchan Aruch that the candles in the shul was always an important issue because there's no electricity, and you always have to have candles in shul. So that was a very common, ongoing expense. And that was the kind of thing that a person would drop at the shul and donate. So that's always an immediate question. So you're not allowed to use that, the Ner, the Shemen, for the Bedek Habayis, or for Dvar Mitzvah Al Kain Kesav Tivkan, which is why I'm bringing up this halacha here in the middle of the Nesiv Chav Gimel. And then he starts going into the technical dinim. He says the din is that first, in order for it to be an esnan, first the money has to be exchanged, and then the deed has to be done. But if it's the reverse, first he does the act, and then he gives her the esnan. So b'shas bia, she wasn't kaina it, so afterwards it's just a matana ba'alma, so it's not an esnan. So that would apply here as well. And also, v'dafka, that the actual object is being brought to Beis Hashem, but if you gave money, you could buy davarach lebeis hakneses or the dvar mitzvah. Right? Even a behem from his bech, you're allowed to buy with the money if it's not the animal itself. And then he says, v'aldvar asher she'oluni. He mentions a practical question he was asked, al kadesha, she'inicha davar lebeis hakneses, so the Sefer Torah could go in mappa, who left something, an actual object for the shul, for the Sefer Torah, like a mantle, something like that. So, is this Bechlal Zaina v'Aser? So I answered when I was asked this question, that obviously he accepts the premise of the question, that it might be a problem. However, you have to know the details, the halachas of this in you. So I answered that you look, the Iker Din is in Mesachas Tzmura, and there you see clearly that because Stam HaKadesha is a Pnuya, so therefore, even in the Gemara, even the Gabi Korban and the Mizbeach, if it's a Pnuya, she's not really a din esnan zayna. Even if he was a kohen, and so there's more of like the kohen has a din isha zayna, and a woman like that might be called an isha zayna l'gabi a kohen. We might get back to that in a bit. But he says in that case it's mutter, because for the Gabi, the din of Esnan Zayna, in order for it to have that title, that description, it has to be an erva, specifically an erva, afilu mechayav ilaven. So, now the word erva itself can mean different things, and we'll see that gets discussed later, but Rabbeinu Yeruchim emphasizes the one that has to be an erva, not a pnuya. Oh, and erva includes even chayav ilaven. So in that case, she's essentially answering because she's a pnuya, so therefore it wouldn't be a problem anyway, even if she donated the actual object, and assuming that even if that was the actual object that she had received originally.
You mean Aisha Sidish? What do you mean that was
yeah, so either married or there's some other arayas. I mean, there's a whole list of arayas in the Torah, so if there's any of those arayas as well. But generally, stam case of Nestan Zayin is probably, the problem would be probably Aisha Sidish, if anything. If not, then it's not really, then the whole thing doesn't apply, he's saying. You'd have to get into what the gather of that is. I don't think that's considered an erva.
But even in that case, as Rabbi Yerucham was saying, she's not giving it for the act. She's just giving it a mappa. So she gave it. It could be from her own money.
Right.
How do you know it's for
So
the
I just noted that. Anyway, it's probably not, but just to make that he wanted to make it known that the whole all the kadeshus that they knew in their society that they're familiar with, it's not relevant anyway. Even though he holds that the din is really relevant, but it wouldn't apply to all these people. And then he gets back to mentioning more pratim. What if it's the other way around? What if a woman gives a man an esnan? It's mutter. Esnan hazachar is aser. And then again, he says, even if it's a real, but if it's money and she buys something else, mutter afilu mizbeach, choshkenu beis hakneses, and if she made a shinoi, chitim and silas, weiter, or the vladis, the children of the animal are mutter. And what if someone says to her, take this and do the act with him? It's also an esnan. If they made up to give one and he gave many, they're all aser. So these are all dinim that apply to Mizbeach, and then he's quoting it all here because he believes it's all relevant, at least in theory. V'oid pashut, that b'chlal, even the thing itself can be given to the bedek habayis, because what's bedek habayis? Nothing in the bedek habayis necessarily gets used on its own. If you give an object to the bedek habayis, they sell it and they use the money. So weiter, that wouldn't be a problem. Even if she gave the object itself to the bedek habayis and they just cash it in, so that should also Mashenkin, the gufa shall esnon, that's the problem, not to use that to sort of decorate the building. So if she gives a mappa, if she gives an actual object, that would be the only time you'd have a question, assuming that somehow she got that to begin with. And then you would end up with this discussion about a pnuya. It says, Barachti bezen, I went into this at length because I saw that people are going too far. Rabbi Yerucham seems to be the only makkah that says there's a problem in the first place, but he's complaining that other people are going too far. And they're saying that it even includes the Kadeshus Apnuyas. So therefore, I came here to set the record straight. The Din Taka applies, but not to the Kadeshus Apnuyas. So that's the Rabbi Yerucham. And now we come to the Ramah. So we said it's in Shulchan Aruch Chaim Siman Kufman Gimel Dinei Binyan Beis HaKnesses Sif Chavalef. So the Mechaber had written Ein Liknes Meilim Shenishtamesh Behem Hedjit Latashmish Kedusha. You shouldn't use a coat that was used for ordinary use and convert it to Tashmish Kedusha. That's a whole different thing. We're not going to get into that. But the Ramah comments Hagah, and he brings the Rabbi Yerucham Bekitzer that also lasses mestin zayna mechir kalav davar shel mitzvah gegoyim beis haknesses say sefer Torah v'dafka meha esnon atzma avalim nosnu lo mois be'esnon mutter luknes ben bar mitzvah, just the object, not the money. V'loy mikri zayna ele iser erva. He doesn't mention chayav elav, and he just says the word iser erva. Aval elo apnuyas hakdeshus shemakdishus davar mutter lekav mehan Rabbi Yerucham. This is all in the Ramah in Shulchan Aruch. So that's what Rav Mashash is referencing, and he's trying to diminish it, that it's only Rabbeinu Yerucham that's cited in the Ramah. And then he says, if you look at the Magen Avram there, so let's look at the Magen Avram ourselves. Look at the Magen Avram, so the Magen Avram gets into the details of this as well. And Magen Avram writes that there's another din in the Rambam, that what if a person gives her something in advance? And he says, Zia etzlacha, keep it, person says he'll take advantage at some point in the future. So as of now, what's the status? Whatever the case is, once Hitaka goes ahead, even if it's a long time later, then the Din Esnan kicks in and it's Aser. The question is, what if he gives it to her, and then she is makdash in the interim before they did anything? And then he went ahead and was bala. So now, how do we look at this? She was makdash first, and then afterwards the status kicked in. So how is a suffix? So therefore, lo yikrav, but the imkarav nirtza. And it has to be that he said that when he gave it to her, that emes shetirtzi kni oisam yakshav. He has to say that you could be kind of whenever you want, even from now, even if we only do the deed later. Because if he didn't say that, then she has no ownership over it. Bechlal, she can't decide to be makriv. So the Magen Avram says v'nidali or v'nidali that the Beis HaKnesses it's a suffix, right? And the Rambam said we should go l'chumra, not be magrav, but if you're magrav it, it's okay. It's a carbon. So he says Beis HaKnesses we should go l'kula because Beis HaKnesses is only d'Rabbanan because the pasuk is only talking about a Beis HaMikdash b'chalal. It says Beis Hashem Aleikacha. And he says, Gam kol ha-paiskim le'yaskidu davar zeh. The Magen Avraham also mentions, no other paisik mentioned this, except the Ben Yeruchim. So therefore, I think that if you have a suffix like this, then instead of going l'chumra, like with a carbon, you should go l'kula. The odds that the Rambam said that if it was karev, it is nirtza. So Ibazoi, yesh leimar, that we have a shita, that wherever by a carbon, it's only b'diavad, by a Beis HaKnesses, it's l'chatchila. And he brings a raya from Kiddush and Siman Reish Ayin Beis, because in Kiddush and Siman Reish Ayin Beis, the wine for Kiddush is supposed to be Yeroi Linasachim on the Mizbeach. However, if you have the wine, B'shulei HaChavis, where there's pieces in it, so even though the Chatchila, it's not kosher Linasachim, but the halacha is, if you bring the wine for Nasachim, B'diavad, you're Yaitza, and it says in Shulchan Aruch, that therefore you're allowed to use this wine for Kiddush, L'Chatchila. So the Magen Avraham wants to make it zushtal, that for a carbon with b'diavad, for our use could be l'chatchila. So that was the Magen Avraham making the point that you should go, it's the Rabbanon, because the pasuk wasn't talking about this, so it's the Rabbanon and Makula. Plus, he mentioned no other place can mention this. So now Rav Mashash quotes the Magen Avraham and says, the Magen Avraham said that the pasuk is only talking about the Beis HaMikdash and was not mentioned anywhere other than Rabbeinu Yeruchim. Just to point out that now that we've seen the Magen Avraham inside, Mashash is perhaps not giving you the full context. The full context of the Magen Avraham is specifically the gabe, a specific suffix that the Rambam mentions in a very, very unusual or at least specific case. He was not making a general point to be mizalzel, to be mekel b'chlal, but Mashash just takes those lines out. The pasuk is only talking about the Beis HaMikdash, and it's only Ben Yeruchim. Plus, he says the Magen Avraham proves from Siman Reish Ayin Beis that according to the Rambam, according to the Mechaber, you're allowed to make a mitzvah out of the Esnan, Hepech Ben Yeruchim, which is also not what the Magen Avraham said. The Magen Avraham brought a raya from Siman Reish Ayin Beis specifically to the idea that if you say that it's nirtza b'diavad and there's a mikdash, like in the case of an Esnan, where it's a case of a suffix, we said it's nirtza b'diavad, so just like by wine, so that was here. So again, not seeming to quote the Magen Avraham exactly the way it says. In a manner that makes it sound like Magen Avraham is completely dismissing the whole Zach Gansen. He says, "V'chein kasa v'sefer Maimon Mordechai." I did not have a chance to see if the Maimon Mordechai does say something closer to this. But anyway, in Cain, didn't he done? There's no chashash iser estan klal, even according to Rabbeinu Yeruchim. First of all, it's money, and second of all, he says there's a lot of sveikas until it's rachik leimar. It's far fetched to say that money is going to taking care of the shoals. What does he mean? L'cheira, he's referencing what he said in the beginning. He was medayek, and he said that this yid owns a lot of property, and this is just one of his properties. So Mistama, what he's trying to say is, there's anyway a self. Who's to say that the money dafka came from that? And anyway, he says there's even a stronger argument to say that the whole Isra Asnan only involves Yisrael Haba al Ha'erva. There has to be a Yid involved. At least the man has to be a Yid. The woman could be a guy. But if the Yid gives her an Asnan, that's also has this din. So Mashma Pasha, the Goya Hanav Elis Lagoy, then there's no din Asnan B'chlal. And even a Pnei Yisraelis, we know, like we discussed earlier, he doesn't, first he brings it from Even Ezer, that the Pnei Yisraelis is not Leinik Rezaina. And then the Rabbeinu, he says, the Ramah himself, who essentially was quoting from Rabbeinu Yeruchim himself, said that Pnei Sakdeshus is fine. So he says, B'nid Nidan, in this Chatzar, it's only Lezainus Nachri, Nachrim Dafka, and he shows the Bekiyas in the behavior of the people in his community. He says, Ve'ein Nechnas L'Sham Mizari Yisrael, Lei'ish, Lei'ish Klal. How do I know this? Because the guy, the Apotropos, was Messiah Lefitumai. He gave us a full report on exactly what goes on. Anyway, everyone knows about this. The Yehudim that have the trouble, they do it undercover. They're not going to stoop so low to go to here. So Mamela, there's no chance of calling it an Esnan at all. And if you call that your Midas Mishulol, he's doing a bit of a rhyme, but like you got to be crazy to say that. And it's just Lashon Hara, you're just trying to besmirch this man and his money. Nachmas Eva, Vicina, and Kinna. People are just trying to pull this guy down. I already said, Chazal already said in Pirkei Avos, Not only you're not giving, but you're trying to prevent others from giving. That's a rasha, right? No one else is donating the money, but the one guy who wants to donate, you're trying to tear him down. And he ends off, almost sounds like he's giving him brachas to be mamshech, I'm sure. And he mentioned his name, didn't seem to feel uncomfortable about mentioning that. So and then he signs Shnas v'cherpas Ama Yosir Leprat Gadol. So depending on whether you count all the letters or Leprat Gadol maybe means not to count, but it's either the end of the Tafresh Pez or the beginnings of the Tafresh Tzaddiks. He signs Joseph Mashash. So l'chayr halacha, as we saw, technically Ibn Yerucham, technically the Rama mentioned that there's an issue, but also technically it almost never seems to apply because it would have to be not a pnuya, a mamash the object itself, etc., etc. And even then, it's not l'chayr they could take it, just convert it to cash if they want. The Beit HaKabayis could do it also. Interestingly, there are another two tshuvas that deal with this directly, and they all seem to come from a similar background, place, and time. The next tshuva is from Rebbe Fall Ankava. So we had that name before with the shul, Ephraim Ankava. So this is a descendant many centuries later. He was miyuchas to him. Rebbe Fall lived from 1847 to 1935. Big Rav in Morocco. He was the first chief rabbi of Morocco. He was born in Salah, and then he became a dayan. And then when the French authorities, who were the colonialist power at the time, decided to create the position of a chief rabbi, I guess like they had in France, they recommended this to Rebbe Fall, and at first he tried to, say no, but ultimately in 1918 he became the first chief rabbi of Morocco, the head of the Beis Din in Rabat, which is the capital. So one of his svarim that was printed during his lifetime is Shailos Tshuvas Karnei Re'im. The aim stands for his name, Rebbe Fall, and Kava, and the mem is his father Mordechai. It's printed in Yerushalayim in 1910, and the tshuvas towards the end, which belong to Chelek Eir Chaim, and Siman Reish Chaf Hei, is the following question, and this question is a bit sadder than the previous one, and it says, Tshuva lekahal para in Brazil. And the date l'chayra from the end seems to be 1901, so right at the beginning of the 1900s. So he says, you asked me...
Is it Peru?
No. Well, I'll get to where it is. No, there's a state in Brazil called Para, near the Amazon. There's the Amazonas, the state of Amazonas, and the state of Para, among many others. So now, what are Jews doing in Para? So I'll get to that in a moment. So you asked me about the pareiches she'asu nashim zaynos l'beis haknesses. In this case, we're talking about, like in the time of Ben Yeruchim, we're talking about Jewish people, and they made a pareiches for the shul. And B'chlal, they bring the Darim and the Dovas to the Beis HaKnesses, and you're asking, are you allowed to accept it or not? And you're telling me that you're asking because people are tining that it's an Isser, Leisavi Asna. Now, what's the background to this question? What are Jews doing there? Who are these women, etc., etc.? So you can find a lot of background to this in an article of 2 parts by Rabbi Leo Birnbaum. He wrote an article about these Jewish communities in Brazil at that time, late 1800s, early 1900s. The main emphasis in his article is on the city of Manaus, which is in Amazonas. So in part 1, he writes that between the year 1810 and 1910, about 1,000 Jewish families immigrated from Morocco to Brazil. And the biggest portion settled in the big cities, which are Belém, which is in Para, and Manaus, which is in Amazonas, that's about 650 families, and the rest in nearby areas, smaller and smaller. And the background to this wave of immigration was that in 1810, Brazil and Britain had a trade deal, and they opened up the ports, and that's officially when the Inquisition stopped functioning in Brazil. I saw the last auto de fe in Brazil was in 1794, so less than 20 years before that. So in 1810 is when the Inquisition finally closed up shop and Jews were allowed to show up. And there was a developing economy. And that's when there was this wave of immigration, Jews in Morocco. The economy in Morocco wasn't great, and this was an opportunity. So not so perhaps well known, but interesting chapter in Jewish history at the time. It continues in part 2, and he says that the Jews in Manaus kept an ongoing connection with their original Kehillah in Morocco. He says, among other things, they actually, young men in their teens used to travel to Brazil on their own to get started, and then when they felt it was ready to get married, they were ready to get married, they'd write back to their mothers to please send them a kala, a neighbor, a cousin, back from home, and so they can start a Jewish home in Brazil. And many shilas, Rabbi Birnbaum writes, came to the Rabbanim and Dayanim in Morocco from the whole diaspora of Moroccan Jewry. And he says, for example, in the shilas of Shuvas of Rabbi Fall and Kava, you see a lot of shilas like this from Jews in this area, Belem, Manaus. And then he cuts to this. He says, in the Karna Re'im, we have this question that shows us about a very terrible situation, phenomenon that was going on. And he, for some reason, hops on that the shilah is from Manaus. Now, I don't know why he decided that. Manaus, as we said, is in a different state. And Belem, which he mentioned, is in Para, and the shilah, the Tshuva does say Kehillas Para, so I'm not sure he made a mistake on that. But then he quotes the beginning of the shilah, and he says, what does this shilah represent? This refers to a very, very terrible situation that was ongoing at the time. There was a very severe problem of human trafficking from Europe to many places, including South American countries. And then he gets into this at great length and gets into the details that, unfortunately, there was a very, very, very strong, there was a lot of Jews that were sort of pushing Jews into this line of work, often through trickery, essentially a form of kidnapping. Would sort of trick them into crossing the sea, and then they were trapped. How are they going to get back? And thousands of girls, thousands of women. There's a lot, for those interested in history, there's a lot written on it. It was fairly well known at the time. You look in the Jewish newspapers in Russia and Poland, they're always talking about this terrible problem. The poverty was terrible, so a lot of people were just drifting around. It was a tremendous problem. So that's what's essentially going on here. You have this Moroccan community, so that's that interesting history. And then there's these Polish Jewish women that ended up in South America in this way. He said, Rabbi Birnbaum writes, when he was researching this, I don't know if there's still, how much of a community there is left. I mean, these places are still on the list of Jewish communities in Brazil, but I don't know to what extent there's still a continuation of these ancient communities. But he says, when I spoke to the community members about this shilah, they said, we know all about it. That, we know that Taka were women in this line of work that came on a regular basis to the president of the community out of Yom Tif to give their donation, their contribution to the religious services in Manaus. And, perhaps they felt that was being a chopper on some level for their situation. Anyways, that's the background to the shilah. That was what Rav Kava was asked in the year 1901, apparently.
So they were Jewish girls?
Of course, yes. That's what we're talking about. Yes. So it goes along generally similar lines. He says, first of all, it's l'chayr gabi karban on the mizbeach, but to do all other mitzvahs, ein l'zeika women agamara, not from the shleisha mudahira, not from the shar paiskim, just Rabbi Yeruchim, with the Darkei Moshe and in the Mappa. And then he quotes the Ramah, he quotes the Magen Avram. He quotes it more accurately, that it was the Gabi the Suffolk, that the Rabbinic Magen Avram says, it's l'kula. So, Asan and Nidin Nidan, there's no Isser. First of all, even if the money that they bought the pareches with, or the money that they donated, is precisely the same cash that they received, you'd still be allowed to buy a davar shel mitzvah with it. Because she came in down, you don't even know for sure where this particular pile of money came from. They might have other money from other sources. It doesn't have a shem esnan. The common way is shenaitim hazaynas shve'ein shem esnan aleim. For whatever reason, either just the way maybe we said earlier, if it's given in the other order, it's not an esnan, or whatever it is. People just give them gifts. So, mutter b'lishim pickbook, even if we had a suffix, whether hapareiches atzma kibla be'esnan, or maybe not, the Magen Avram said that in this inyan, we paskin suffix l'kula, so even if it was mamash hashayel in the pareiches itself, and you held like a ben Yeruchim, it would still not be a problem. Kal v'chayim ben b'nei shel kal v'chayim, that whoever gave a pareiches as an esnan, so Vada was bought with money, and then the question is, it's B'chal Safik where the money came from, like I said, so it's a heter gomer. And anyway, Madach said, Hapnuyas Hakdeshus are Bechla not together, so if there's no Chi of Karas, so Mamela, that's surely the case over here as well. He says, Hey Nemes, we find in Ibn Ezer that it's not so pashut when it comes to a kohen and who he can and can't marry, and there's an Isra saying to buy a kohen. It says, Kol shehi be'Isra lav. And one of the Isuri lav is Hadif Eles Lagoy. If a woman was Nif Eles Lagoy, that makes her a Zayn Lagabe the kohen, which by the way is its own important subject, and it's important for Shluchim to know this din. For Hayalei that Shliach has an older single kohen, he's like, he can't get a grusha, so he's looking and he tries to match him up with someone. But Hanav Elis Lagoy, din of the Shulchan Aruch, is not is also asr to the kohen in the same manner that a grusha is. So that's its own discussion. So in Avada, these women in this industry, it's they're not just servicing Jews, they're servicing Goyim. So if she's an Elis Lagoy, say she is a Zayn Lagabi a Kohen, but like Kanav Zelzeh, that's Lagabi a Kohuna, they're a Machmir. Masha Enkein over here, he says it's B'chayave Kodesh Dafka. Like the Magen Avraham said, because the Magen Avraham Taka writes in another Sifkat in there, he brings the whole discussion with Chayav Elav, and the Magen Avraham says, Kan, the Ramah wrote, Isser Erva, and he's medayek from the Ramah, Isser Erva means, Kalemar, Dafka Chayav Kresis. Because there's a machlekes, there's different shittas, so weiter. Magen Avraham has this yisoid, that whenever there's a suffix, we go lekula by a base of knesses, so a machlekes about Chayav Elav is also a suffix, so we go lekula. By the way, like I pointed out earlier, Rabbeinu Ruchim, who's the marker for all this, actually says clearly Chayav Elavin. On the other hand, he clearly says that Pnuyas HaKadeshus are fine. Fine. Akopanim, everyone seems to agree that if it's Pnuyas, it's not a problem. So Mikola Amor, first of all, you should stop calling it that. Why are you calling it an Esnan? It's not an Esnan. From Mifkaris Ba'alma, there's no Chiyav Karis, they're not Chayav Kresis. And even if there were Chayav Mechayav Kresis, it only has to be the object itself. But to sell it and bring Chalifin for Dvar Mitzvah, or she herself takes the money and buys a Dvar Mitzvah, wonderful, it's beautiful. He adds at the end, though, that if you feel that you want to be Migdar Milsa, you want to set some standards in place to not normalize and accept this the type of behavior to sort of make it an acceptable part of the community. So that's up to you. That Taiv Nechem Tasu, Hashem should help you, and he signs his name. Another Sefer Yeshua's Essa, which was printed mamish in the last 10 years. It's written by a nephew of.
He doesn't end up like in Morocco, where he's brachas and he says
Right.
That it is
Keep going. Well, there he said part of his argument that it was all goyim servicing goyim, and then here it's.
But he's saying at the end, if you want to be machmir, you
yeah,
can be machmir.
Yeah.
But then before he was saying
that was different. That was a different situation. That was goyim servicing goyim, and it's just a yid making the money all the way at the top, so it was a lot more removed. Yeah. Here we're talking about Jewish women from Poland among the Jewish community, and probably sort of employed or enslaved by other Jews. So there's a lot of problematic stuff going on over here. It's not the same. It's a much sadder situation. And the Sefer, so there's a Sefer Yeshua's Essa by Rafa and Kava's nephew. His name was Ephraim Shalom and Kava. He was also Rav Morocco, etc., etc. So there's a chelik called Psakim, and in Psak Lamed Vav, he discusses a similar question with fewer details. He just says, I was asked, Me'ish Echad al Isha Yisrael is Prutza, who wanted to give it a double base Knesses, maybe like a menorah, a candelabra, something like that. And he wasn't sure, because Esnan Zaina, and the base Knesses and Mitishma'at. So he goes down a different path. So first of all, he says, it seems like he didn't, when he first heard the question, he bechlal, who's Bahavant in Hilchos Esnan exactly. His first thought, he says, is that it should be a Pesach, Lachzer B'tshuva, Abolatar, Messiah, I said, wait a second. The same thing would go for a carbon itself. The Torah said not to take a carbon. Okay, wait, let me look it up. So I looked it up. Before I looked at it, then I thought, Mela carbon, it's most to bring this actual animal on Mizbeach, but money is fine. And she says giving money or menorah. Then I looked in the Rambam. Oh, sure enough, turns out money is not a problem. Okay. Baruch shekivanti ladas elyon. The kol shekei, and if she bought them the object with money, so pashat that it's mutter, because even for a carbon it would be kosher. What if she got the menorah itself as the esnan? So now back to hot like the carbon again. So Gamza nearly the hotter because the Rambam wrote, it's ein aser ela davar haroy likarva gabe hamizbeach, right? Because the din applies to a carbon, and you can only bring a carbon from something that's roy to be brought on the mizbeach. So the Rambam wrote that. So Mamela, anything that's not roy, if it's not a behemoth or a bird or a shemen or silas, so then it's mutter. And he's going to go on, but it's clear that he completely is unaware, overlooked the Ben Yeruchim and the Ramah, plus his uncle's Shuvah. And in the footnotes, it was printed a few years ago, in the footnotes, the person says, it's surprising that he wasn't familiar with his uncle's Shuvah. But anyway, now Ephraim Shalom takes the discussion in a different direction, which is also important for us to become acquainted with. So he goes in this direction. He says, in the Torah, in Yerdei assimilation and test, in Hilchos Tzedakah, the Torah quotes the Rambam that says that a guy that was donated for Bedek Habayis, you're not Makabel Lechatchila, but if he gave, you don't return it. Mashenken Beis HaKnesses, you're Makabel Lechatchila. The Prisha, the Torah says, why is the Shul not like Bedek Habayis? Because Bedek Habayis has greater Kedusha. So what do we see from here? That even things that are also for Bedek Habayis, for sure, the Kedusha is Nazchamer. Again, he's oblivious to this discussion at a time. So he's looking in Staka, and Hilchos Staka, it says you can be Makabel for a Shol Lechatchila. That's what it says in the Torah that I'm the Prisha. There's even more than that. We find in Shulchan Aruch Simulation and Dal and in the Ramah and the Haggah, it says over there you can be Makabel from a guy, again for a Shol. Avaloy min amumar, you can't take from Meshumet. And the marker is in Mari Vile. And the reason is because in the din of the Gemara, you can be makabel a carbon from a guy, but you can't be makabel a carbon from a meshumet. And the Gemara seems to mention something there in that context about a ner for a Beis HaKnesses. So the Marival says, since you compared the ner to a carbon, so mashma goes in all details. So it's more of a chumrah. So since a meshumet has more of a chumrah lagabe carbon, so meshumet will have more of a chumrah lagabe Beis HaKnesses. So right, so that's going even further. We said a guy you could accept for Beis HaKnesses, so meshumet you can't. But look in the shach there. The shach says in the chuvas of the mabit, you are a kabel min amumar, because this is what it says in the mabit. He says, "Afagav damir nadam kiakar mikem loitzias amumar." It's before the Gemara not to be makabel a carbon from a meshumet. Hainu be carbon the damile. Only a carbon something similar, but the hektish laniyim, a hektish shpayis the Beis HaKnesses. In that case, it was referring to an actual house for the shul. Knidam mekabelin. Now, just to be clear, the context in the mabit is a little more complex. The question was, there was a guy who was makdish a house to the shul. Then he became a meshumet, and he was not giving it to the shul, and he wanted to sell it. And Reuven bought it from the meshumet. And now the question was, is the mecher a mecher b'chlal? Can Reuven keep it, or do we say that it's already hektish to the shul, and there's no right to sell it, so Reuven has no right to buy it? So he starts off by saying that Be'etzim the hektish is a hektish. The hektish the meshumet is, because it's not like a carbon according to the mabit. However, the maskana actually happens to be that the mecher is a mecher for different reasons. So what's the reason? Rabbi Ephraim Shalom Ankava says, because we see in the shach, elsewhere in Simulation and Dalad, Gabi a goy b'chlal, why can you take tzedakah from a goy? So he says, Hey Gimel Aleph, which is the Hagoyes Alfasi, which was the old name for the Shilti Gibonim on the Rif, and Perek Kamad Baba Basra, which is where you have the famous sugya about the tzedakah from goyim. So they said the reason that you shouldn't take is a b'reishat tzedakah mechaperes. We don't want to give them that kapara. But nedarim v'nedavis ain't boyin lechaper. There's no element of kapara here per se, so we don't have a problem accepting it for that reason. So that was what the reason the Gabi Agoy. So now Ephraim Shalom is trying to sort of put it all together. So even if this Isha wants to be menad of the Beis HaKnesses, or even the menorah itself, from the bias of the mumar. The bias of the mumar is even more obvious. It's mamish. People are going to call it the Beis HaKnesses Shalamumar. And call that mutter because nedarim and nedavis are not balachaper. So again, this is not mamish quoting it exactly via state. First of all, the mabit didn't write this reason. Mabit Shach brought two things separately. One legabe the mumar from mabit, and one legabe the goy. And B'chlal, the Mabit never said what to do with it because the Maskana of the Mabit was B'chlal, they had no chance of getting it, and he said that the sale was a good sale. So he never actually said what would we do in a situation where we have this bias shalom mummer and people are going to call the basic message and we never really got to that? It's misleading to think that the mabit passed in Allah Lamaisa to accept the bias when that's not what actually happened. He just said it in the context of something else. So not as straightforward as he's putting it all together. But even clearly, we see that by a guy, we said you can even in a case where you wouldn't accept the carbon, you accept for a show. And or about stalker for about the bias, you accept for a show, and in Mummer, even though the Ramah brought to me vile that you don't, but my bit seemed to say at least that Hagab Yew and the Shah quoted this. So it's still a kosher came to here or something like that. And he says with Pshitos, we found that Mechaber himself in your day assimilation and test brings the din that a guy who's donated a menayer davar achal basic message makabel, as long as it's bedas yisrael hefrashti, as long as he's having in mind what a yid would have in mind. But if you don't know what he had in mind, then it's ton geniza. So the Taz brings two reasons. What's the issue over here? One reason is he's thinking about Avodah Zarah. He donated to the show, but he had Avodah Zarah in mind. That's not acceptable. And number two, the Beis Yosef brings from the Rambam that it could be when he donated it, he was thinking a carbon. He doesn't know, he's not familiar with the minutiae of Jewish law. In his mind, he's donating a carbon. We don't do carbonas here in Shul. So, Mamela, we can't really do anything with the money because it's for a carbon and we can't bring a carbon. So if those are the reasons over there, weiter, those don't apply to this woman. First of all, Kavanos says Lashamayim. And she's not having in mind carbonas. Where would that come from? There's no Beis HaMikdash. So Mamela, you can accept it, even a menorah, shekibel be'esnan atzmoi, because it's not the roy the karva gabe mizbeach. Again, not counting the ben Yeruchim, which he doesn't mention at all. Kavachemer kasef. And this is ladaiti again. He has a more positive, unlike his uncle. He has a more positive. He says ladaiti adrabe. It's better between the carver this way to accept it. And if you don't accept it, that will be merachiker. But for Makabla, maybe she'll do tshuva. Happens to be that in South America, it was much more complex. First of all, there was a whole group, it was a whole industry. It wasn't so simple. It wasn't just like a woman who is having a hard life or something like that. So it could be, it's not even really a stira if it's an individual versus this. But anyway, he has a more positive attitude. So along the way, he introduced us to the whole discussion that we have in Goyim Mishamadim. And he's taking all the coolest from there, like Gabi Goyim and Gabi Mishamadim, and he's applying it here. And along the way, he mentions that, at least according to his understanding of a bit via the Shach, that even if it was Zeis based like Knesset Shalamumar, according to his understanding, that would be okay. But on this last point, the person who wrote the Ma'ar Mekaymis on this Sefer Yeshuas Esa sends us to a Sefer called Nar Mitzrayim. Nar Mitzrayim was written by another Rav you probably didn't hear of. His name was Rabbi Fol Aaron Ben Shimon. He was born in Morocco in 1848. And he passed away in Eretz Yisrael in 1928, and he was the chief rabbi of Cairo for around 30 years. He was born in Rabat, Morocco. He made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael with his father as a young child, and then ultimately he ended up in Cairo as a rav, like we said, for 30 years, from 1991 to 1921. Interesting personality. Anyway, Nahar Mitzrayim. What's Nahar Mitzrayim? It's Asifas Kol Minhagi Dinim Shel Ir Ve'em B'Yisrael Mitzrayim. So it's the feast Seder of Shulchan Aruch, I believe, and it's just time of minhagim that have a unique something unique from the minhagim of this town, of this city, Cairo. So he writes, "B'inyan Akdeshus Mibneis Yisrael," and he throws it in Rosh Tevis Ches Mem He, which stands for Chutz Mei HaKavod, which apparently is what you say when something is not geschmack. Yeah, use Rosh Tevis when you like something. You don't like something. So Rosh Tevis is Ches Mem He. The Makdisha, it's Pareches Chadasha, or Mapel Sefer Torah. So he says, Min Adin, you're allowed to accept it because it's not the Guf HaBeged is not an Asna like the Ramah wrote and Shulchan Aruch, Ben Yeruchim, straightforward. Ha'amnam, you should not accept it. Rav Ben Shimon says, Im Shmam Hanimos, if their disgusting name is written on it, and that should be there in the Shol, the Zikarin, in the house of Hashem. Hashem is Seinei Zima. He says, we had a story here, Uvda Hava Poy Mitzrayim. There was a Kadesha Achas who was Makdash Pareches, Lahechal HaKodesh, Menu Beget. But Hamarasha Sahi, very judgmental, says that she wrote in big golden letters, Muzhavais, Ubartais, that you can read from across the shul, and said her name. And I spoke to the leaders of the community and I said, this is absolutely abominable. Plus, she's still in business. Idena Yeshavas Bakuba and Bachuri Yisrael are still being nichshel. So imagine these Bachuri Yisrael walk into shul and they see a big advertisement on the wall, essentially. So while they're trying to daven, this is maskeras oven zima v'teyeva basically kim. So when I pointed this out to them, they immediately gave the order. Begun to a saparecha sahi yishalem Hashem palom hatoyv. And b'chlal, he says the gaboy hakehilas should be chosem al kavod koinam, look out for Hashem's kavod. And if they're makdish, parechas, servitor, rimainim, they could accept it. But we said not a problem to accept it. But tonight, lo yizacher v'lo yipaked. Their name can't be anywhere on the object. Another Maisa, and I saw in a book that talks about Mitzrayim, that there was also, any big city had this type of subculture going on. So there was a of the B'Kadesha Achas, there was Makdash Sefer Torah to the shul, and we accepted it, but tonight that she has to understand and accept that her name cannot appear on it at all, and that's what all the Rosh Hashanah Kodesh have to keep in mind. So that's a point that he makes rather forcefully. The Reish HaKollel, Rabbi Shucha pointed out to me that there's a makar somewhat al derech zeh from the Rebbe that's also included in his sefer. That's Malak at the minus. In the year Tafshin Chav Ches, when they bought 766 Eastern Parkway for the library, for the Rebbe's library, etc. So Rav Lukrinsky asked the Rebbe if he finds donors who want to donate svarim or money. Can we put their name on the svarim or on the shelves? So you got the following minor. They printed the Ksavat Kodesh in Shura about 10 years ago. Rabbi Lukrinsky printed it in the Einikel's Shura. That on the words im yimtzu anoshim, if they find people, so they have circled and added hagunim uschumim asimim. If they find anoshim hagunim, people that are upright. And the amount is significant. Don't just give away hakdashas for nothing. So the Rebbe is saying that if you're not sure, but rather not, the Rebbe throws in a line. Whatever that's referring to with the Chassidim and their attitudes and how they think about things. But this Nakoda Hagunim and Kaim Safik Sheva Al Taisa, so the Rebbe is not really spelling out what the issue is halachic, is it not? But at least you see this idea that Rebbe is saying that it has to be appropriate to put their name up on svarim or shelves in the Rebbe's library.
But you can still take their money, just the
right.
Put their name on.
Right.
From the Rebbe's.
Yeah. The question was, if we find these people, can we suggest we put their name? And the Rebbe is saying, I'm not. If it's Hagunim, right. But Pashtos take the money, but don't put the name. That's the Chayra what it says. So that's essentially, that covers the main question we were discussing today. Just to wrap up a few other loose ends. So we already mentioned the related shayla of taking from a guy, and many have written about this at length. So for example, in Shut HaShluchim Chelek Aleph by Rabbi Leib Nachmanson, Siman Ayin Aleph. So I'm not saying that he's a Bar Samcha, and people have opinions about it safer, but at least it's an introduction. It shows you what the issues, many of the issues relating to Shlichus are, and it's surely covers a lot of Makairis, so it's surely good as an introduction. I also saw that the Reish HaKollel Rav Shuchat actually composed his own tshuva on the question of accepting donations from Goyim, and he has it unpublished, I believe. And they quote a lot of shaylos and shuvas from recent generations that get into the details, and you have to look it up. In the halacha, there are a lot of details. It's nuanced, it's complex. It depends on the issue, whether you can solicit, whether you can't. Whether you can solicit, maybe you can't solicit, whether you can put their name, maybe you can't put their name, lots of details. It's important to be familiar with the details when it comes up Lamaisa. I just want to point out that there's an interesting connection to this week's Parsha. So there's this whole question of accepting karbanos from Goyim, not. So one of the rayas that comes up in these discussions is from the Parsha after Makas Chayshach. Moshe tells Parai directly, Gam ato titem biyadenu zvachim v'oiles v'asinu Hashem. So Chayra Moshe is directly telling Parah, you're going to give us karbanos. So some of the recent Shalos Tshuvas cite this as perhaps a raya, and the Ibn Ezra apparently says clearly, connects it to this issue. of being able to take karbanos from a guy and apparently even solicit. He's telling Pare, you're going to give us. Others or Deicha, they say no, he's not asking Pare. He's saying, but Derech Nevuah, that what you're going to do, you're on your own. You're going to want to do this on your own. I'm not asking you. But that's just an interesting tie into the parsha. Another question we have.
But it wasn't to the base of Mikdash.
It was karbanos today, Mishnah. Estan Zaina is more about a carbon than about the base of Mikdash per se. It does say Beis Hashem Aleikacha, but it's karbanos.
The whole reason why, for example,
but I'm not talking about Estan Zaina here. We're talking about accepting karbanos from a guy. The guy is not a din of Beis Mikdash, right? The guy is a din of carbon. Whether you accept the carbon, whether you can ask for a carbon, and stock is being possibly compared to that. So that's.
What did he mean that in the Mishkan, that Pari is going to give it in the Mishkan or Stam? When they asked to leave Mitzrayim, to bring out Karbanos, he meant after the Mishkan?
Yeah, it's its own discussion of the makriv Karbanos between leaving Mitzrayim and putting up the Mishkan. Okay, so that's its own discussion.
After that, the boy could.
Right? So when we machalik another chiluk, fine. Good. Karbanos is interesting, somewhat of a connection. You see that this conversation is happening between Moshe and Pari about giving Karbanos. There's also the question about the Mechal Shabbos, which Bechlal, the Ikar Adin is that a Mummer Mechal Shabbos is a Mummer L'Kol HaTorah Kula. So when we talk about a Mummer, Mechal Shabbos is synonymous with that. And the Shach, we already said, the Shach from the Mabit said that a Mummer you could accept. However, in Shulchan Aruch Chaim, Siman Kuf Nandal, and the Ramah, and Sif Yud Aleph, this din comes up as there as well, and the Ramah writes there as well. Mummer Shenas and Shaiva in Erla Beis HaKnesses is also Lahadlikoy from Ari Vail. And Adarach, we had in Siman Rishon Dal and Yeridea, the idea that the Nair and the carbon have the same din. And the Magen Avram there says that it's like a carbon, She'en Mekabel Menu from a Mummer, unlike a guy. And even a Mummer L'Chal Shabbos, Slavad, the Magen Avram himself says clearly that this includes a Mummer L'Chal Shabbos, because that's how it works by a carbon. A Mummer L'Chal Shabbos, you don't accept this carbon, so that would translate over into here as well. Then he quotes the Sefer Chassidim. The Sefer Chassidim says that if the Meshumad gave money for a Sefer Torah, you could accept it. Although even in the Sefer Chassidim, if you look it up, it's not actually as simple and straightforward. The Sefer Chassidim is his own discussion. Magen Avram quotes that. And then he says, "V'chein kasav hashach b'siman rishon dal b'shem habit." So the Magen Avram starts off sort of expanding it to Mechal Shabbos, but then sort of ends off quoting the Shach and the Mabit. Look at Mishnah Berurah there. He quotes most of the Magen Avram, but the way he seems to understand it, or Paskin, he brings the Reish Halacha that Mechal Shabbos you're not allowed to accept for a shul. Only a Sefer Torah is mutter because Sefer Chassidim says Sefer Torah, and he omits the end about the Shach and Mabit. Even though the Machzah Shekel Taka says that from Magen Avram, by ending off the way he did, it sounds like Magen Avram is ending off that you could accept. So you see, there's a discussion. It's not you have Yeridei, you have Yeridei Chaim, you have the Magen Avram, you have the Shach, you have the Mishnah Berurah. You have in Shuvas Von Hagas of Ramesh Sternbuch, you have two questions about this. Can you take money for a yeshiva from Mechal Shabbos? So he quotes Shulchan Aruch Kuf Nadalid, Ramah Reish Nadalid, and Yeridei Shach. He says the Stei Chemet was matter for a shul. He says only something that's mamish like a carbon. I didn't see the Stei Chemet to see how he explains that. And then he quotes a tshuva of the Chabiner of Dov Beresh Weidenfeld and Dov Mishanim Chili Gimel, who had a similar question. B'zman hazeh, what do you do l'maisa? And the Chabiner tried to taina that a shul might be a problem, but if it's a Talmud Torah, if it's a yeshiva, that might be okay. And the Shuvas Van Haga says, Rav Steinbach says, I hold that even if you ask for a shul, we have a lot of dinim in shuls that change, because we say that the shul mall was mamash a fully proper shul, but today it's all al tonight to eat and to drink. We sort of undermine a lot of the halachas of Beis HaKnesses with this logic. So we can apply this to that as well and say that when it says Lo lachem v'lodnu livnei beis Elokeinu and Ezra Nehemiah, that's dafka when it's mamash like mikdash, but our shuls are already not daimel mikdash. He wants to diminish the chivas of a shul. It's not daimel mikdash enough.
Nobody else brings this mekhudah, and in Morocco before.
What?
Nowadays it's not a real base.
No, this might be his chiddush of Shivas Van Hagas. But Benidin Didan, he's uncomfortable with the name, putting the name up. That's a gnai that a Mechal Shabbos for Hesi has his name, even though there's a whole discussion about this thing today, whether a Yid who is Mechal Shabbos has a din of Mumar L'Chal Shabbos, because they're Tinuk Shinishbu, and would they do it in front of a Chashuv person? Right? You have this whole separate discussion. So even though you have these tainas, and Bad, you see he wants to donate a lot of money. It seems like he has his heart in the right place, but there are Makkaitis that say that for something like this, even if you did tshuva, apparently, I think it's referring to a Mumar L'Chal Shabbos, or Mumar, that Even if he did Shuvah, it's not L'Reich Nechayach, so Kol Shkein Mechal Shabbos to have his name inside. But he says, at most, the name could be outside on the building. That's better, even though it's more public in a sense. But if it's outside, you're not seeing it inside the building. That's his logic. He says, in my shul, I made sure there were no names on the shul inside, only outside, because I was afraid who knows whose name is going to end up on the wall. So I made a rule, no names inside. But if the guy actions that he wants it inside, so the Shabbat himself gave an eitzah that you should do it, Le'ilin Ishmas, the last Shemer Shabbos in this guy's family, his father, his grandfather, you look for someone who was a from a Yid, and you say, you're being mazaket to that person, and he as a Yiddish, as a whatever, is doing it on his behalf, and that guy will feel happy, and that's a name you can put up in big letters. He said, even that, you have to do it, against a Maisa, you have to first build it, and then be makdash it, and he has a whole seder on how exactly to do it. And then he's assigned to his next shuvah as well. The next shuvah is B'chal Shabbos for Hesya for a shul. This was about a yeshiva. But what about a shul? If you can put his name up, so weiter, goes through a lot of the same stuff. Shulchan Aruch, Eirach Chaim, Shulchan Aruch, Yeridea. And then they're Machreinim, they're Mekel, B'zman Hazeh, Chil Shabbos, it's not an Azus, it's a Tinik Shenishba. So if you see that he's taka, the guy means well, and he's just Tinik Shenishba, maybe be Mekel, and B'chlal, you see that he's trying to donate. He feels connected to religious people, even though religious people are mamash and miyut. So you see that if he's reaching out to us, why is he even paying attention to us? Clearly, he's deserving of kirov. And if you're merachik them, then it pushes them even further away, he writes. But if you're makar of them, it might bring their whole family closer. And in this case, the community doesn't have the money, so I'm matir. But we should remember again, he has an issue with writing the name inside the shul, because here he says kedushas kamei azara. So therefore, you should not put any names inside the shul, even religious people. That way, you avoid the problem. And then no one will feel offended because no one's name is inside. But he ends off and says that if you could build it with money from Shemer Shabbos, it's much better. And you see that how they're medactic in the Tara of Liman HaTinoikas when it comes to davening, when it comes to learning, the money that you put in makes a difference, brings different stories and different Gedolim, Chaim Brisker, the Chafetz Chaim only accepted money for his yeshiva from Shemer Shabbos, because he felt that Lo Ilahem V'lo Nehuven Espeis Elikenu, and if they're shutef, then it has an effect on the yeshiva itself. Which itself, this is essentially bringing up the final point, which is that in addition to the din esnam, which is its own halacha gather, in addition to the din of mummer, which is also its own halacha gather, you have the general question of money from Averis, not the person. It's just the person has, dirty money. And let's say he's involved in ribbis. Let's say he's involved in, he's machshel rabim. He's doing things that are being machshel people, almost like that story, but he wasn't being machshel yidden, he was being machshel goyim. But let's say someone's being machshel yidden taka, and he's making money from that. Or let's say guys b'chal, the etzim chilul Shabbos. Forget about him being a mummer l'chal Shabbos. Money from chilul Shabbos. So that is its own question. Now, interestingly, and this for mamash finished. Sikh of Yudabes Thomas Pshintezayin, the Rebbe was speaking about people that think that through money of ribbis, through money of chilul Shabbos, we can help Eretz Yisrael. The Rebbe says it's not going to help Eretz Yisrael, it only makes things worse. It's a letter afterwards to Rabbi Yalis from a few days later, Yud Zayin Tammuz, Tavshin Tazayin, says, I just received your letter and your comment. It'll be interesting to see what the comment was. But he says, Dvarei hoyu al dvar momen haba mei chilul Shabbos v'loi mimechalale Shabbos u'mei hava beribis v'loi meloikche ribis. And my point was that those who think that this money is helping, it's like a mutual benefit, he's making more money and he's helping. It's not fully clear, but this is how I understand it. What the Rebbe was essentially saying was, he was being, and the Rebbe explains, he's referring to two issues. The mashal the Rebbe used was about putting out the fire with kerosene. The two issues the Rebbe was being at the time was the bonds, that Israeli bonds were not done with the heter iska, so it's mamash ribis, and the Israeli ships, which is its own topic, and the Rebbe says these are two things I've been screaming about for a while, and no one's listening. So what the Rebbe seems to be saying in the letter is that there were people that were actively trying to promote Israeli bonds. There were people that were actively trying to promote Israeli ships. They're saying, here's how you can help Israel. They're saying, if you're marketing this and saying, here's how you can help Israel, so let me tell you, that's not helping Israel. But in the parentheses, they're saying, seeming to say that I don't have a problem necessarily per se with taking money from a Mechal Shabbos. If someone's Mechal Shabbos anyway, and he gives the money, or he's being Lekeach Ribbis given anyway, I might not have a problem. The problem is that there's an ongoing campaign to commit these Avedas on behalf of Israel. So L'chayr Natzich is not a raya to this question, and in fact in the letter it's mashma farkert, although not fully clear. And Choleifen, there are other Makaidas that deal with this. There happen to be a lot of shuvas that have a more negative take on like taking money from Avedas, but ultimately in every such question, when in doubt, ask a Rov.